So just thinking about the learning outcomes, it's really just to build on our knowledge of contextual safeguarding and child sexual exploitation and criminal exploitation, and just thinking how that applies directly in practice. Just thinking about the vulnerabilities of children and young people in relation to extrafamilial harm and how we can work effectively with them. And then just thinking about our awareness of these issues within our organisations or within local authorities. And just to support, I've put participants for those who are CSWs, but really to support anybody within our local authorities who is working with children and young people in relation to contextual safeguarding. When I speak with colleagues who are involved in contextual safeguarding, the reoccurring theme is that it's a really, really difficult to manage and difficult to predict outcomes and what's going to happen for children and young people. So really just wanted to use this session as an opportunity to share ideas and thoughts about the work that we're doing within local authorities. So just to start us off, just when we hear the words contextual safeguarding, if I could ask people just to pop in the chat the first things that spring into mind when you hear those two words, and I'll just give you 30 seconds or so just to pop some thoughts in the chat. So we've got exploitation, risk outside of the home, harm outside of the home, in the community, risks in the community, vulnerable children, community risk, CCE, CSE, lots of harm outside of the home and thinking about what's happening within communities as well, which is great. So I just wanted to start off with a definition really of contextual safeguarding. And as many of you have alluded to in the chat, contextual safeguarding is an approach to understanding and responding to young people's experiences of significant harm beyond their families. And I've really highlighted the salient elements of the definition here because it is about children and young people forming relationships outside of the family home within the wider community. And some of these relationships can be dangerous or lead to dangerous, risky consequences for them. And interestingly, this morning, I was just listening to the news as I was getting ready, and there was something about a new piece of legislation being enforced around the use of social media and mobile phones and how they're going to try and restrict that to under 16s. And when I was doing my research in relation to contextual safeguarding, like the use of technology was really prolific in relation to criminal exploitation, child sexual exploitation. So I listened to the news with interest this morning that sometimes when we put things into place to protect children, it sometimes has a reverse effect in that they'll find other ways to access social media. So it was really just to highlight that we're thinking about harm outside of the family home, and that was a huge shift in social work for me when I was involved in Operation Sanctuary up in Newcastle, because we'd always thought about harm happening within the family home for young people who are care experienced, within residential settings and within foster placements, but suddenly we just started to think about harm to children in a really different way. So as I said, just a further definition, I'm not going to read all of this because I think we've covered on it, but it's really recognising that different relationships that young people form in the neighbourhoods, in schools and online can lead to violence and abuse. And I think the point that I really wanted to have, raise in this is, parents and carers have very little influence over these contexts. So I did some work a couple of years ago with a charity called PACE, which is Parents Against Child Exploitation. And what those parents were saying was they could not control what was happening. The pull for the child to get to the abuser was far greater than the parent being able to protect them and stay in the home. And parents just felt really, really lost, and that they had no control. They talked to me about young people climbing out of bedroom windows in the middle of the night. They were trying to keep them safe, locked in the house. And, it was literally just such a challenge for parents. So it was really, I just wanted to think about understanding from a parent's perspective how difficult that must be when you have very little influence or very little control over what's happening in a child or young person's life. There is on the next slide, Nahal, if you could just share a longer definition, which comes from Colleen Furman, who I'm sure you will be all familiar with, who is a professor of social work based up at Durham University. I'm not going to read that quote out, but I just wanted to put that on there just for future reference for you to look at through the slides. So as I say, just therefore, as I say, future reference. So Colleen Firmin was the brains behind developing contextual safeguarding. So she developed it over a period of 6 years with various different local authorities, and it involved three separate stages. So the first was an attempt to make small changes within the child protection system, and as social workers we all know how difficult that can be. And the second was a systematic change in the whole system to embed contextual safeguarding. So I was thinking about this as from a first order and second order position of how we bring about those changes. And then finally, when looking at the learning so far, it was about considering policy and practical changes that are required. So as I say, it was piloted within a few local authorities, and then obviously the concept of contextual safeguarding was developed even further. If you could just move on now. So for those of you that know me, I absolutely love a quote, and I listened to a lecture from Colleen Firmin when she became a professor of social work at Durham University, and did a lecture, and she used this quote, "Count the children, not the chip shops." And I think for me, this quote really tried to dispel the myth that CSE only took place in fast food takeaways, and it didn't focus on the wider community, and it didn't make links to places and spaces. And when I think about my experience of working within Operation Sanctuary, it was all about takeaways. That was where the abuse, and we missed so many opportunities because the media portrayed it in that way. We looked at it in that way, that the abuse was happening in certain places, that we forgot to look at wider community. And as I say, it's just a really simple quote, but it really, really resonated with me and made me think outside of the box in relation to contextual safeguarding. So just wanted to focus on significant people and places here. And I think there's four stages to this. So I think contextual safeguarding, as we've already said, happens outside of the family home, but it can happen in multiple places and in multiple ways. So we need to be thinking about peer-on-peer abuse, criminal sexual exploitation, online abuse, thinking about missing episodes. And I think when I'm thinking about online abuse, and I know that I talked about this earlier about it being really prolific, but there have been some really high profile cases of late in relation to online abuse where children have been groomed. And also thinking about practice, a lot of the children that I worked with who were looked after by the local authority, thinking about those perpetual missing episodes where they went missing from either foster placement or from residential settings. And I suppose just to highlight, I think one of my biggest mistakes I made as a social worker, when I was thinking about those young people that were going missing, we were looking at secure orders to keep them safe. And in essence, that absolutely backfired because all it did was it broadened the network. So when we had missing episodes concentrated in Newcastle, we knew the spots that they were most likely to go to. But after the secure order ended and they came back to the northeast, obviously that their network had expanded across the country. And I really regret that now, thinking about it, what could we have done differently to respond to those risks? We also have risks associated with gangs, risks associated with radicalisation, safeguarding risks in public spaces, and also risks around trafficking and modern day slavery. And it still always intrigues me that in the midst of the inquiry that I dealt with, which did lead to a serious case review, we got more convictions from trafficking than we did for the actual offence. And when we think about trafficking, it can be as simplistic as moving a child from one house to the house next door will constitute trafficking. And I think previously when we thought about trafficking, we're thinking more along lines of like children being trafficked into the country and out of the country. And also when we're thinking about significant people and places, we're thinking about multi-agency practitioners. We need to engage with individuals and sectors who have influence over this. So that's thinking about things within the community. And when I was studying and doing my research around it, I was really interested that McDonald's changed the music that they played to classical music to discourage children and young people from hanging out. And I just thought that was really quite bizarre, but actually it did have an impact on the children and young people. So it's just thinking about what else we can do within the community. If you could just move on. Thank you, Nahal. So as I've already talked about, so this work comes from Professor Jane Reeves, and thinking about contextual safeguard is about places and spaces which have historically been important in social work, but it's also thinking about relationships differently and thinking about professionals, how we work together, um, thinking about contextual safeguarding. So as I say, we're not just thinking about the home environment now, we're shifting outside of that remit and thinking about the places and spaces that our children and young people access, go to. And as I've already said, this could be around school, places out in the community. Thank you, Nahal. So as I say, we really need to think about that multi-agency work, and which has always been crucial in social work, which is highlighted in every child death, every serious case review. But we need to recognise and think about the interventions that were put into place because they're a critical part of these safeguarding practices. And just to finish off, contextual safeguarding therefore expands objectives of child protection systems in recognition that children and young people are vulnerable to abuse beyond their front doors. And that's something that often as social workers we may feel that we have very little control over. We'll have control over keeping children safe within the family home because we'll have child protection plans and we'll have various strategies and things put in place. But when that harm is happening outside of the home, it can be really difficult for practitioners and professionals to think about how best can we keep a child safe. Thank you. So this approach is also embedded in the McAllister report of 2022. I'm sure many of you on the call will be familiar with Josh McAllister, who was the CEO here at Frontline. So he talked about different ways of supporting children and young people who were at risk of harm outside of the family home. So things like county lines, criminal exploitation or sexual exploitation or abuse between peers. And what the recommendation was thinking about a bespoke child protection pathway through a child community safety plan. So that would involve the police, social care and others that can provide a robust child protection response. Now, I know from speaking with some colleagues across local authorities, some local authorities have embedded such a plan. I don't think it's rolled out nationally or fully recognised, but it was just thinking about a different way that we could support children and young people rather than the traditional route of a child protection or a child in need plan. So just on the back of community mapping, I'm just going to ask if you could just listen to a little recording. This is from a former participant who did this as part of a research for a dissertation, thinking about how to work differently with a young person.
This young person's name is Annie. My name's Kate, and I'm going to read you an excerpt of my dissertation on extrafamilial harm and a piece of work that I did in a session with a young person. This young person's name is Annie. She's a 16-year-old female living in foster care in East Sussex. I met Annie in London. We went to a park and found a quiet sitting area. I spent some time chatting with her, giving her a chance to discuss anything on her mind and ensuring that we were collaboratively setting the agenda. Once there was a natural ending to our conversation, I showed Annie the map I had bought of the area she currently lives in, East Sussex. I explained to Annie that safety mapping is something that we do as professionals, as it is a useful visual tool that encourages collaborative working. Annie was not sure about using the map. She stated, "I have problems everywhere. There is always a problem somewhere, somehow," and then she picked up her phone. I had bought a map of London to show Annie as an example of a safety mapping activity. I began talking about places that I went to when I was growing up, areas that I wouldn't have gone to on my own and areas that I didn't feel safe. I didn't go into detail on my map. However, it was a way to show Annie how the tool worked by using my own experiences, hoping to create a more trusting and relatable space between us. Annie immediately looked at the map of East Sussex, pointing to one town and stating, "I'm hated here. People always want to come for me because of a party I went to where my friend was carrying a knife." I encouraged Annie to place a red sticker in this area, and we began to discuss the party and the events leading to her feeling unsafe in the area. Annie shared, "To be honest, I'll go anywhere. I just know to be in certain places with friends and not on my own." I reflected on what Annie had said. I wanted Annie to understand that without even realising, she is safety planning by choosing not to be alone and understanding this risk. Annie responded to this saying, "It's obvious, I know the deal." Annie used the map to explain to me where the different gangs are based and the conflicts between them. She was sharing information openly. Annie began to talk more specifically about people she knows who are in gangs. She said, "I'm not involved in any of that. Some of my boy mates are, but to be honest, I find it all just embarrassing." I wanted to end the session highlighting a protective factor for Annie, as I was conscious of the heaviness of our conversation. I asked Annie, "Where do you feel safe on this map?" And there was a long pause, and she said she did not know. I prompted Annie to think more specifically. "Maybe there are certain buildings or someone's house you feel safe in," I asked. Annie explained that she felt safe at her old foster carer's home and 2 of her friends' houses. She placed green stickers in these areas. I acknowledged that this might have been a difficult question for Annie, as I was conscious of her past experiences of moving several times and how it takes time to establish safe places and safe people. To the end of the session, I explained to Annie that I'd like to keep the map. I suggested that we could copy the map and we can keep it in her file and add to it together over time. Annie agreed to this. I thanked her for being open with me, and I reminded that the information she shared will be recorded as normal, like I do during my visits. I texted Annie following the session, letting her know that I enjoyed our time together and felt proud of her openness. Annie opened up to me about her drug use, gangs within the area, and her relationship with several young people in these gangs. She spoke about areas she feels unsafe and areas she would not go to on her own. I felt that Annie took an expert position throughout the activity. She provided the information and I responded with curiosity and non-judgment. It was positive that Annie agreed to continue the mapping exercise during future visits. During my phone call with Annie getting feedback, I first asked her, "How did you find the session?" One feedback that she gave me was that she liked being outdoors and out of the home. It helped her to be in a neutral area that didn't cause her further anxiety. Trauma-informed practice guided my reflections around this, prompting me to consider further past experiences and their significance to a specific context. I asked Annie, "How did you find the mapping activity?" And she shared that it helped her concentrate and she thought it was good. She said, "The map was good because I forget things and it helped with remembering stories and things that have happened to me." Mapping with young people is a way to support them to lead with their own knowledge and expertise to identify where they feel safe or unsafe, prompting collaboration and avoiding practitioners placing themselves as the expert. It helps young people feel empowered as the expert in their own lives.
So the next thing I wanted to think about is the position of safe uncertainty. So the work of Barry Mason. So I think everyone on this call will be in agreement that the media portrayal of CSB has been instrumental in relation to how we respond and how we work. Obviously, we know how the media has portrayed and been very stereotyped of perpetrators of child sexual exploitation and children and young people who are sexually exploited or criminally exploited. And we're thinking back now to Monroe's report in 2001, that's just saying that the concept of uncertainty is inherent in the field of social work because the system that we're working is actually a really complex one. And like many of us have said already, systems can't be predicted. We can't predict outcomes for children and young people. What we need to do is work towards a position of safe uncertainty. So we're always remaining curious. We're thinking through the lens of a non-linear position, and we're hypothesizing what might be going on for this child, young person. And we're not wedded to one particular idea, because the minute that we become wedded to this is what's going on for this young person, we'll lose that position of curiosity and we're not thinking about other potential things that might be happening for that young person. And I think the position of safe uncertainty is inherent in social work. And for those of you who are practice educators or who have worked with students, we know that people who are qualifying as social workers need a position of safe certainty. They need to be told, this is what's happening, this is what the outcome is. But as experienced social workers, we know that that can never, ever be predicted. So it was just thinking through the lens, as I say, that we always need to have, operate from a position of safe uncertainty, because the minute that we stop having a position of curiosity, that's when we miss out on what's potentially going on for a young person. And really as well, just to highlight when we think about extrafamilial harm, we think about things that have happened more recently, so thinking about the inquiry in Rotherham. But actually, when you unpick and think about it, there was an inquiry that took place in Telford led by Tim Crowther QC, and that was back in 2018. It was an independent inquiry, and he reported abuse of young girls, up to 1,000 young girls, as far back as 1970. So extrafamilial harm isn't a new concept. It's always been there. It just hasn't been talked about. So as I say, we just need to think about that position of curiosity constantly when we're thinking about the young people, and not just in relation to extrafamilial harm. I think in social work in general, we always need to be curious as to what's going on. Thanks. So just building on what people were saying and thinking about some of the great comments that have been made, like Margaret was saying, a child protection plan doesn't necessarily keep a child safe, and it doesn't. It's the networks around is what I personally believe. But when I was doing my research at Kent, we talked about complexity theory, and when they introduced complexity theory, it's based on the dynamics of astrophysics. And I was like, why on earth are you teaching social work as something that's based on astrophysics? But actually, when I started reading about it, it was really, really interesting. So literally in application to social work, so complexity theory comes from Stevens and Cox. And what they're basically saying is that complexity theory can explain any kind of complex system. In its most simplistic form, it takes a non-linear approach. So action A may lead to action B, but it could also lead to C, D, or E. So it's always operating from that position of curiosity. We can't predict the outcomes of what's going to happen. So it could be argued that complexity is really an ongoing and reoccurring theme in social work. So we know what happens in local authorities. Something happens, there's a child death, there's a child safeguarding practice review, and there's a knee-jerk reaction. Local authorities put policies in, we want legislation change. So we take that as I say, knee-jerk response. So when I think about contextual safeguarding, and we had the checklists and stuff that came in, and new policies were written because obviously it was high on the agenda within the local authority that I worked at. But what complexity theory is saying is that knee-jerk reaction is absolutely not beneficial, because you can implement and put different strategies in place, but unless exactly the same situation happens in exactly the same way, you cannot predict the outcome. So they talk about this linear approach. So it really reinforces that processes and protocols in social work often have like a one-size-fits-all approach, which, according to complexity theory, is saying that's not appropriate when working within complex systems. So when we're thinking what Margaret was saying about the child protection plan, so we have the child protection plan, we have our regular meetings, we have our stat visits and everything that we're doing. But what complexity theory is saying is that is not enough to protect a child, because we cannot predict what the outcomes are going to be. And I think just thinking about complexity theory, like children and young people live within a family who live within a community, within a society, which is a complex system. So as I say, I wanted to bring back about complexity theory, because at first I was like, why on earth is this relevant to social work? But as I read more about it, actually it is really, really relevant, because we can never preempt or predict what's going to happen in a family. If we could, we wouldn't have any child deaths. We wouldn't have children who are being sexually exploited, criminally exploited. So as I say, it's not directly linked to social work. It comes from the basis of astrophysics. But I just wanted to introduce you to that, because I think it's just really, I just think it was really intriguing to me to think through a different lens, and really, it really reiterated the importance of being curious and not thinking that we can predict the outcomes for the children and young people that we work with. So as I say, just building on that, so problems also occur when professionals within the system, as I said, believe that by following procedures, the outcome for children and young people will be predictable. And we know that it's not, because as I say, we have children who are on child protection plans, who are being visited regularly, who suffer significant harm at the risks of parents or carers. And this non-linear approach pertains to a concept of intervention equals protection. Intervention doesn't equal protection, because as I say, we wouldn't have child safeguarding practice reviews, we wouldn't have child deaths, we wouldn't have all of the complicating factors involved in social work if intervention equals protection. Obviously, there are cases absolutely where intervention does equal protection, but through the lens of contextual safeguarding and extra familial harm, we can't protect children outside of the family home because we're not always there. We can protect children within a family home because we can have robust safety plans and things put in place, robust child in need plans, robust child protection plans. But when that harm is occurring outside of the family home, it almost feels as social workers that some of that control that we have over keeping that child safe is minimised. So, as I said, there are some references on the slides, but complexity theory just, it really intrigues, because I was just thinking, so if you've got a young person on a child in need plan, on a child protection plan, they're being visited regularly by the social worker, the assumption cannot be made that this will be enough to keep the young person safe from further exploitation or risk of harm. So I really just wanted you to keep that in mind as we move forward. I'm acutely aware of time as well, so I will move us through. So I just wanted to think, and I know that Rosa talked a little bit earlier just about that systemic approach. So just thinking about the commonalities between systemic approaches and contextual safeguarding. So not only do systems need to change, but professionals need to understand more about young persons' presenting behaviour and move away from that first order position in a linear way of thinking to a more contextual and social understanding of abuse and behaviours. So when professionals operate from that first order position, it's seen that the professional is the expert, which then leads to working separately from the young person and directing young people to bring about change in their lives. However, what is required is a second order approach to contextual safeguarding, where environmental factors, beliefs and relationships which underpin problems are rethought. So within a second order change, professionals enter into the family system, whereby the young person is the expert of their lived experience. Professionals maintain a position of curiosity and a non-linear approach is taken, and professionals will collaborate with young people about change and identify strengths within the family, whilst also addressing the risks. So we've talked a lot about curiosity, we've talked about a lot about non-linear approach, but also thinking about those first and second order changes, where actually the young person is the expert in their lived experience and in relation to what's happening to them. So many of you may well be aware that contextual safeguarding is now part of Working Together 2023, so it is actually recognised within there. So when we are undertaking assessments, they should now consider how a child's experience within their family and networks, including their friends and peer group, and extra-familial contexts such as places and spaces where they spend time, interplay with the risk outside of their home. So I think I just wanted to flag that it is recognised. And if we can just move on to the assessment framework triangle, our old favourite, you can see it's also been added onto there. So on the family and environmental factors, we're now asked to consider extra familial context. So it's there whether we're thinking a young person is at risk or is being criminally or sexually exploited. We're asking those questions now within the assessment process. So just thinking about some of the challenges and some of the assumptions. So the current child protection system needs to safeguard children and young people beyond their parents to include peer groups and wider community. So as I say, really drilling down, thinking about those places and spaces, thinking about that community mapping, thinking about mechanisms for peer assessment and how we could build that into the work with children and young people. So a little bit like in the recording that we listened to with Kate and Annie, where they were identifying places where Annie didn't feel so safe or places where she felt safe. Thinking about the children and young people that we're working with, like thinking about the friendship group, which friends do they feel trusted to go and talk to? Are there any people in the wider group that they feel anxious being around or feel scared of? So really thinking about that peer network as well. And we need to look beyond parent individual assessments to try and think why is some of that behaviour being presented rather than using that labelling. We need to be curious as to why is the young person behaving in this way. Interestingly, when I was looking at the research, boys and young males are far more likely to come to attention through the criminal justice system in relation to criminal exploitation and sexual exploitation, whereas girls, young females are more likely to come to the attention of children's social care. So really to be mindful that sexual exploitation, criminal exploitation, it does not discriminate against male, female, anybody who identifies as non-binary, trans, LGBTQ, it does not discriminate against them. So we really need to be mindful about that, because the media portrays it in a very specific way. So it's about thinking that this can affect any person at any given time, and thinking about our social graces. It doesn't discriminate against race, age, class, culture. It doesn't make those distinctions. These things can happen to anybody at any time. And some of the young people that I worked with, were from very middle class backgrounds. Parents were professionals, but people just didn't see it because they had assumptions that it was going to be children and young people in the care system, children and young people who had learning difficulties. And it was just about opening and people thinking that any young person is vulnerable to sexual exploitation or criminal exploitation. So we've just really got to hold that at the forefront of our minds. So I've already talked about this a little bit, but just thinking about when we complete genograms with children and young people, just thinking about that peer mapping, like if they had friends that they would have close to them on their genograms, what would that friendship group look like? But thinking about people who they wouldn't want in their close networks, we've really got to unpick that and think about a young person's peer relationships, think about the risk, but also think about the protective factors. And often friends can be a huge protective factor. So really being curious about what is happening for that young person, thinking about the friendship group, I think is really, really important. So as I say, peer group mapping and peer group assessments. So it's providing a detailed picture of the roles and relationships between individuals, including the influence and control individuals have within a network. And it's thinking about the scale and seriousness of vulnerabilities posed by identified peer groups, individuals and locations. It's focusing awareness on information gaps. We don't know what we don't know, but by being curious and asking those questions and really getting to understand a young person. And it's about providing a foundation for the management of the peer group location within a multi-agency partnership. So thinking about who else is involved with that child, young person who may have additional information, because we don't work in isolation in children's social care. And I already touched on this a little bit at the beginning, but just in relation to online grooming, which has increased significantly in the midst of lockdown back in 2020, we saw the figures absolutely escalate, and unfortunately they haven't come back down. And as I say, it would be interesting to see if this new policies and legislation is passed, which I was talking about earlier in relation to restricting social media to under 16s. They're talking about it having to be fingerprint and face recognition to get onto social media sites. And in some ways, I think it's really good, but in other ways, I also worry about the dark side of that. Like, how will it push young people to access things in a different way? But as I say, in 2023 to 2024, there were more than 7,000 sexual communications with child offences online. That figure is up 89% from 2017 to 2018, which is just, it just blows my mind. And the key messages are that grooming has changed from the context. So Finkelhor wrote about the 4 preconditions that a perpetrator needs to abuse a child. And whilst that model still has validity in some ways, grooming now has evolved, so it's happening in and offline, and sometimes a combination of the two. And grooming is a huge, huge social problem. When you think of Brack Bednar, the young boy who was groomed online and was eventually murdered, how many stories we hear about young people meeting people online who are posing as somebody of a similar age, and then it's an undercover police officer working with them. So as I say, it's just evolved massively. And as soon as we come up to speed with technology, so things like Instagram and TikTok and all the other social media platforms, perpetrators find a new way of accessing and being able to groom online. And often offenders use online gaming sites to target young people, as well as in places like sports settings, schools. So it's really just to be mindful that, as I say, online grooming has increased hugely, and also peer-on-peer abuse is also increasing. Sorry, Nahal, you can move that one on. So just in relation to child sex offenders, to incite victims to commit sexual attacks via webcam, sometimes paying facilitators to stream live contact abuse, with the offender directing what sexual acts are perpetrated. So in the UK, it's estimated that there were 80,000 people who present a sexual threat to children online. Now, those figures were from the Home Office in 2019, and they haven't released any more up-to-date figures. I often question why any more up-to-date figures haven't been released. But they just think about, as I say, all of the online stuff. So children may never meet the offender face to face, with all of the abuse taking place over the internet. So as I say, that could be via sending images, webcam, or live streaming. And the abuse may begin online, but can lead to face or contact in person. So just to think about all those different contexts, it's such a huge area that we're covering. I hope you've enjoyed that session. It's given you some food for thought to take away back into your practice or back into your roles. But no, thank you so much.